another edition of Shift Change, the Connected Worker webinar series. Each month, Dozuki leaders bring together lessons, observations, and hard-earned insights from 500 manufacturers worldwide. Now, today's topic is bridging the corporate frontline disconnect. And we have with us Dozuki CEO, Jerry Dolinsky, and Dozuki VP of Product, Allan Young. Gentlemen, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
So we're going to dive straight in today. The timing is perfect. Jerry, you just got back from the Manufacturing Leadership Council's Rethink event, and you were telling a story to Allan and I about some conversations with executives about communicating between the front line and the C-suite. So kick us off with that.
Sure, Scott. Actually, I'm going to start a little bit on a conversation I had actually before the Rethink event, and it's a little bit of a long story, so bear with me. But I think it's relevant. I think it was the weekend before Rethink. I was out golfing, and I was golfing with a gentleman that his family's had a very, very successful business, right? And the entire family's been successful. So we're sitting at lunch after, and we're having a conversation around, what's going on, what's your week look like, and this company that their families own happened to be a large manufacturing company. So I said, hey, I'm going down to Rethink, which is part of the Manufacturing Leadership Council, part of the National Association of Manufacturing, which he knew very, very well. And I started to kind of explain some of my challenges, right? And I said, look, I've been traveling my entire career. I have 3.8 million, 3.9 million miles on Delta. It gets really frustrating with, the amount of time. Parking's a hassle right now. TSA lines can be X. And my last flight, the flight attendants were late for about an hour and a half. And I could see he was starting to disengage a little bit. And he finally interrupted. He goes, Jerry, look, I really can't relate. And I'm going, well, Bob, what do you mean you can't relate? And he says, look, I've been the CEO of our company. I sit on the board right now. And since the day I was born, I've never flown a commercial airline. And I kind of said, what? I said, you've flown around the world. He goes, look, the family and the business have always had private jets. And he says, look, if I was going down to Arizona, it'd be pretty simple for me. I would just call my assistant. She'd make sure the plane was ready at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'd drive my car right up to the tarmac. I would get on the plane. People would unload my luggage. I'd land at Scottsdale National Airport, which is, I think, is going to be 5 minutes from where the event is. My driver would take me to the hotel. So I can't relate to anything you're saying. So you take that away. And I said, when I went down to the MLC, it said, wow. I mean, that's a disconnect I just had, right? A life that maybe I'd love to live, but I don't live that life, right? I'm down in the weeds. And I was thinking about that with most of the people we're talking to on a daily basis are in the weeds, right? They're dealing now with the TSA. They're coming into the plant floor where 3 people haven't showed up. There's the supply chain issue where my raw materials aren't at the line. I have a machine that is down. And I started asking questions around different executives over at the MLC, asking them, what's top of mind for you? And of course, it was a geopolitical environment. Of course, it was tariffs. Of course, it was gas prices. As I went further down and talked to both C-level individuals, managers of divisions, and even down to the plant management, it really came down to a couple things. One was, look, as a manufacturer, we have to grow. Number 2, we also have to look for better efficiencies. Those 2 line items drive profitability for us. Either I grow more and stay the same efficiency, or I grow less or stay flat but get more efficient. So all the people that I was speaking to is all about numbers. It wasn't about wow, the TSA line was going to be, looks like it's 45 minutes, or as it equates to the manufacturing at the executive level, they weren't talking about the raw materials arriving there at that line. And they weren't talking about Bob, Betty, and Jim who didn't show up to work. They were just simply talking ROI. So it was an interesting, and I thought it was curious that we were having this chat here today. Was this disconnect from what's happening on the front line to what's the preview of the executives?
Right. So we have the daily frontline activities, and then we have these like executive level KPIs. So, Alan, this is a good time to talk about OEE. So that's a great example of how Dozuki can map to the front line if you want to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we come into and what Jerry was talking about, really the executive team, they look at the numbers, right? And then the health of the business. And facing a lot of the geopolitical issues that we have today, a lot of people and CFOs and COOs are looking at how do we preserve margins. So when we, especially when we're frontline, trying to communicate to the executive leadership team, we want to try to center in around what are the things that they care about, and then work backwards from that, right? So, for example, we were going through an exercise talking to a customer CFO on what is the overall value and what is the ROI that we can drive with a connected worker solution. So we start at, okay, well, why do you want to focus on margin? How do you impact margin? So the more good quality units that you can produce in a period of time, the lower the cost per unit and the better the margins, right? So, okay, well, what is a number that we can use to represent that? So in the process industry, it's OEE. In the discrete industry, it's what's called first pass yield. But for this example that I'm going to try to trace back, let's just use OEE because really a lot of the OEE components also encompass first pass yield as well. So if we start with the end in mind, okay, well, talking to the CFO, you want to improve margin. Let me show you how that kind of maps to a number that represents that, which is in manufacturing, which is OEE. So OEE is made up of three components. It's made up of availability, performance, and quality. And when we talk about availability, availability is uptime. And so how available is that production line able to run? And really, and that really should basically say, hey, now the line is ready to run, you have a expected rate. What impacts availability? And really there's, in the OE world, there are three, we call it downtime losses for availability. One is the amount of time that it takes to set up or change over that production line, right? So as people are working on the line, setting up, are changeovering from one SKU to the next SKU, that line is not available to run. There is a second loss, which is preventable breakdowns, right? So as you're running the line in the middle, there's an issue with the line and then it stops and it breaks down. Can be due to a lot of reasons, equipment issues, configuration issues, material issues as well that cause jam. And then the last piece is really around just the overall time it takes to maintain and repair that line. So, for example, looking at those losses, really, how can a connected worker platform influence that, right? So again, now we're working our way backwards and tracing the whole thing that, well, to impact the changeover time and setup time, if you have folks that are, you capture that tribal knowledge on how to best change over or set up that line and document that so that your entire operations team is following the same process, you have a great baseline, and then you're able to, identify continuous improvement opportunities from there. Same thing with, preventable breakdowns. You can have a operations checklist so that you check for things every single time before you start the line. You're able to, have all the different things that you check for so that, you reduce the variability in the startup process. And same thing for repair, right? So a lot of folks, when a piece of equipment breaks down, the first thing is that they go to diagnose it. And usually that has a lot of wait time for getting the maintenance section to come over. But if we empower the frontline operator with some of the initial troubleshooting steps, they can have more informed opinion on, okay, when I call the maintenance tech over, I already tried scenarios 1, 2, and 3, they didn't work, and then they bring over the right equipment. So again, that's reducing the overall availability issues there. If we look at performance, right? Performance, there's two main issues. Again, this is performance versus the ideal performance rate. Usually, if it doesn't match that, there's two main losses, right? Speed losses. One's called minor stops. So basically, the machine is kind of ramping up to speed and it stops. And then also the second one is around just the overall slowness of the machine, slowness of the line as well. And really, this is related to potentially leveraging a connected worker solution to drive operational workflows. So if there's a reason code for some of these stops, You can record that and then have resolutions for that. And you also kind of record them in the system so that you can see what stops are most prevalent. And really, okay, let's talk about the last one in terms of quality and work our way back from there. So quality, the most two things that impact quality in terms of loss is scrap and yield loss, which means that as you're starting up, there's a lot of kind of bad quality product, and then so then that also goes to scrap as well. And really, the two main things that impact scrap and poor quality is just around training, right? Because the operator is loading the machine, the operator is setting up the machine. So in terms of a connected worker solution, the main things that we can do to impact that is the training aspect and then the skills management, upskilling of that aspect there. And also, as you're doing the quality inspection, you can enable operational workflows to accompany those. So again, this is how when you're talking to the CFO, you can work your way backward and trace the lineage of how a connected worker solution and all the different capabilities flow up to impacting the margin.
That's a great model, Alan. Availability, performance, and quality as these three key pieces for OE. And you've done a great job kind of getting into the weeds. I love looking at the different codes and thinking, how that impacts it. So now let's think about the workers. We have operators, engineers, machinists, and they got their Dozuki tablet. They have access to the content. They're making comments, making improvements. So what happens when they speak operational and then the executives speak financial? Like that's part of the disconnect. So Jerry, how does it become a language issue? What should they or should they not be saying in order to really get through to that top level?
Look, I mean, I don't think, I think it's translation
Hmm.
versus transformational,
Mhm.
meaning that, look, these operators, these engineers, they know more about what's driving downtime. They know more that's driving quality, right? Safety. However, when they start a conversation, more times than not, they chat about the problem, right? Going back to the conversation I had with the gentleman I'm having lunch with, right? He can't relate to that problem, right? He just jumps on a plane and he flies down to Arizona. He doesn't want to hear about TSA pre-check lines. Just can't relate to that, right? So executives want to talk about numbers. Allan started mentioning some of the numbers underneath there. So instead of saying, look, I need my standard operating procedures, my work instructions are the ones that's causing my downtime, right? I need that. People can't relate to that. What executive can relate to says, well, look, do you realize 45 minutes of downtime cost us $5,000 in profitability? And oh, by the way, right now, currently at this plant, we're experiencing 24 45-minute downtimes every single month. And you take that times a three or a full 12 months, that equates up to $1.5 million. So now you have the executive's attention, right? Because any executive says, look, I don't care about, the little details underneath there. I do care about saving $1.5 million. Now you come up with the solution, right? And the solution to do that is XYZ. And I think that's the biggest difference. I think because including myself at times, you're so in the weeds and you're firefighting, right? And in the back of your mind how we can prevent these things, right? Take a look at scrap as an example. If my scrap is at $3 million underneath there, I know if I bring that down by 1.5 million, that's 1.5 million in savings. So I think a lot of it is the advice to the engineers underneath there they have is, look, pick what spots that you know and that you can measure. Identify what you believe the return on investment of those spots. Then come up with the solutions behind it. So leading with the real dollar value. Because if you sit back and any executive, including myself and my own company, I have only so much capital that I can spend, right? And anytime you want the biggest bang for any additional capital, any additional expense I'm going to put into the business, what has the biggest return? And I know that, look, for this plant, right? I know that this is what OE should be underneath there, but what are the things I need to do to get the most out of this plant versus adding another machine, adding another individual?
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And, Alan talked a lot about training as a force multiplier to get frontline workers to think that way. So, Alan, to what degree are you seeing this in training programs? Is Dozuki helping them think in that way so they can translate, to use Jerry's term, for the executives?
Yeah, I mean, I like to like I said, we start off with like the initial hypotheticals, but I also want to give like a real life example of
Yeah.
how training really impacted financial results, right? Because I was working overseas in a factory for a couple of years, and we actually came up with a project, Project 88, it's called, but really kind of setting the background of this is that so the business was growing, right? And the demand was climbing. We needed additional production capacity. Um, so really the obvious answer is like, well, we need to install an additional production line, which has a capital expense of $1.5 million for that production line. But the catch was that from a factory layout standpoint, it was already maxed out, right? So in order to install that additional production line, we would have to expand the facility and all the construction and engineering that comes along with that. So you're looking at almost like at a total cost in like $3 million. So really that is the part that kind of so that's a problem that we had at hand, right? So really okay, well then we started looking at investment costs on there. Just to give everyone a kind of some context, the facility itself had 11 lines that were all supposed to have the same identical throughput, same equipment, same design. But as everyone knows in reality, the throughput rates are all different. Um, and what was the main variable? It's just really the people that were running the lines. So basically, we had 11 lines, teams of of four across two shifts. So we basically termed this project called Project 88, right? That's kind of where it came from. Uh, so basically we're looking at, well, why are some lines have a better OEE and throughput than others? And we're kind of trying to dig into to that piece. And the way that we structured it was, okay, well, we realized actually a lot of it has to do with just the experience level and skill level of the operators. They know in terms of when there's a breakdown, they know exactly what the root cause is, and then they go to address it. Versus some other newer operators, they were just waiting for their team lead or a maintenance tech to come over. And like I said, that all equates to the time that it takes to produce something. So what we started with around with this project was that we started a skills matrix of some sort, and we started to pair different groups of operators with different people. So we started to migrate them around, and then pair different experienced folks up with inexperienced folks, have different teams run on different products, um, and really this overall process, I think it took about 5 months to run. It resulted in a 10% OEE uplift across all 11 lines. So again, to talk about the disconnect, that maybe doesn't make any kind of way up to the executive level, but as we presented the project, right, well, what does that actually mean to the executives? So going back to the original story of, hey, well, we needed a $3 million investment. Actually, that 10% OEE uplift mitigated that because we were able to now to receive that additional demand because we unlocked the additional capacity by just increasing the line's OEE by 10%. So that was the huge unlock. It's like, okay, well, now actually instead of me having to invest all $3 million in there, we just gain more efficiency, and then that offset the entire capital cost. So that is a very good way just to say how does training relate, and then what is the ROI of that?
Yeah, that's an incredible number. And so 5 months, 10% uptick in OEE. Give us a sense of like proportion. Is 5 months fast? Is that average? Is that slow? How would you characterize that time?
Well, I mean, 5 months is insanely fast. I think for any program to move like this, right? Especially if you're looking at overall like capital installation. capital installation, it will take about a year and a half to two, because now you're
Hmm.
breaking down the walls of the factory, you're ordering the line from, at this point it was a German manufacturer, so you had the lead time to make the production line, ship it from Germany to our location, install it. It was probably a year and a half process, and within
Wow.
5 months we just unlocked that capacity.
Yeah.
So again, now you also have the opportunity cost savings from that.
And we talked a lot about from the perspective of the frontline employee and what they can do to communicate more effectively. But let's not let the executives off the hook. Let's challenge them. So, Jerry, what are they getting wrong? You talk to executives all the time. So, in terms of their perception of the front line, what's the misconception they might have?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think they sit back and they believe we have all these tools, right? And we have all these, we've invested everything. Because a lot of it is probably what Alan said is before you build that, there's a huge business case, right?
Right.
That all we got to do is get OEE up to this. And if we do this, if we do that, we're just going to print money underneath there, right? So they're so lost in that because they already saw the business case, they bought in, they stamped off underneath it. And the disconnect is a little bit about they're not in that plant, right? They're back and they're thinking, I'm bringing back up the PowerPoint I got with what it can do. This isn't my problem, right? This is Alan's problem. Alan, you go fix the challenge. And when you go back and ask for more money that wasn't on the original business case, and if that is a connected worker platform or whatever it may be, they're saying, whoa, whoa here, why wasn't that original plan? I thought you had that figured out, right? So, securing the executive of buy-in gets back to where we originally started, right? And it's picking points, smaller points around this is not about a new transformation underneath there. This is about how we're going to impact some of those items, be it scrap, downtime, productivity, et cetera.
That's great, Jerry. And Alan, as an example, to build on what Jerry is saying for these points, you worked at Colgate for many years when you wore a younger man's clothes, to quote Billy Joel. So, what do you tell your younger self? What should young Alan have done in that position, trying to kind of do what Jerry is recommending?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, as you progress in your career, then you start to have kind of like more viewpoints and outward viewpoints, right? So really, like if I were to kind of again, if we start this all over, we would say, okay, well, no, we need to digitize knowledge, right? That's an operational problem. But the next thing is like, okay, well, how do you get support across your entire organization to invest in that? And then, say that, okay, well, you can hold that requirement to yourself, right? Like I need to digitize
Right.
knowledge. Everyone kind of understands it, but no one actually understands the ROI of that. So then, to my point, then I would start to kind of work backwards on, okay, well, who is my sponsor that I need to get on board with this to, again, like a lot of these programs are executive led. They're top down, they're pushed out, and that's how you get the spread of the program. Especially if you're working in a big corporation, and you want to try to gain that visibility and that buy-in from your executive leadership, right? Which actually, gives you a great career path. Okay, well, how do I communicate that to my leader? Like, well, if my leader, for example, is responsible for, my top VP at the time was the chief supply chain officer, so his core metric was OEE, and then I was like, okay, well, how do I connect digitization of tribal knowledge to OEE, so that way I can paint the whole picture for him. Otherwise, then he's trying to guess and then try to connect the dots himself, and then he's a busy guy, like he's not going to understand. Okay, well, how I connect from here to there, just as Jerry is mentioning with the disconnect, he won't even know how to connect the dots. So me as a person that's kind of up and coming and then wants to kind of get recognized, let me help connect the dots for him, and then so that he can see the ROI. He can, again, we had assumptions on what it takes to invest, and go from there.
Yeah, that's great advice for your younger self. Jerry, another to kind of pass this over to you. You've seen executives over the years from a variety of companies in the manufacturing sector. What's your advice to them? What do you tell them to do tomorrow to try to, bridge some of this gap?
Well, I think it's narrowing it down, right,
Right.
to individual pieces. Going back to what Alan said on the different components, there's even a component even lower than that, right?
Hmm.
Take a look at downtime, scrap, and so forth. Understanding and going in there and understanding your own KPIs. I'm amazed as I walk factory floors and I walk into these that people really don't understand their spend, right? Or the effect of these different processes. So one of the things that my recommendation is start small, right? And look for individual pieces on what do you want to impact. Take that impact, flow it up through, as Alan said, is what the global supply chain had. And I having that person understand with if we do this here, this is the incremental basis points, is how it's going to improve OEE. And so I think it's getting down and it's almost where educating, right, the executives, but not going right into the weeds, but getting that common language back into the translation of how does this translate into Y. More appropriately is that if I go talk to a CFO, right, and I say I'm going to improve productivity, you're probably going to get 17 more questions, right? Because how many times has the CFO heard productivity? If I go to the CFO and says our scrap is $3 million, I can decrease that by 1.5. The CFO is not going to ask more questions because he knows I bought $10 million worth of product. You scrapped 3 million of it. That's real money. So you're going to get their attention, right? And just so Alan knows this too, is that the CFO knows that when equipment is down, I mean my lights are still on. I'm still paying leases on this equipment. I'm paying all these employees, and I have $10 million of raw material. Yeah, I want this equipment up. So it's getting down to those basics that they can relate to.
Yeah, I mean, like one super tactical advice, just to kind of build off of what Jerry mentioned on scrap. Um, and I could also say that it was like a lot of these VP levels, they do these factory tours, right? A lot of the people on the call can attest to that. I remember very distinctly at that point when it kind of changed the trajectory of my career was one slide that I presented on this. And it was the most simplest slide that there was. And I remember to this day, right? Because, from the chief supply chain officer, it's like, why can't we do that? Like, no, why weren't we doing that now? And just get it approved. So back to Jerry's point, was that it was around, scrap, right? So I showed before, right? And then all the issues. And then after this program, how much the savings was, and then all the different steps to do it. It was a 2-column slide showing before and after, and then the result of that. And like that was like just like a simple one slide thing, and then there's obviously a lot of details behind it, but in terms of presenting to your executive sponsor, that's all they needed. What is it now? After you do this, what's it going to be? And what do you need from me?
Beautiful. That might be the first time in history a single slide has changed the trajectory of a career. So congratulations. You are the first. You are the Neil Armstrong of slides. Way to go. Okay, we're going to wrap it up in just a minute. A couple of summary points and some final thoughts. Let's take a look back at what we've done. We talked about the corporate frontline disconnect as we kicked off, looking at different key business metrics within OEE specifically. We looked at a bunch of workforce behaviors to improve the metrics and some tips and tactics on how to communicate the value from the leadership. So to wrap it up, let's once again get very specific. Let's talk about Monday morning, 5 days from now. What's the first conversation someone should have? Who are the people in the conversation? What should that conversation be about in order to execute on what we're talking about today?
Go ahead, Al.
I can take it. Like I said, I think I will look at the initiatives that I am working on currently, right? And it's like, okay, well, how do I get better higher level visibility of it, right? Because what you really ultimately want in a large enterprise is really, buy-in of it, and then expansion of that program. And again, in my experience, that's also how you are able to gain better exposure to your senior leadership team. So again, when I'll start my day on Mondays, okay, well, what are the initiatives I'm working on? What is it to me? And then how do I, again, communicate this back to my executive sponsor? And then again, once I have that, like, dialed in, setting up a call with the executive sponsor in whatever forum, they do a lot of these plant reviews, and then just presenting that to them, and getting them to buy it. Like, it's actually a lot easier than a lot of people think it is, because again, if you structure it in a way that makes sense to them, easily presentable and easily digestible of the information, it's a you need to make it a no-brainer, right? I was just talking to Jerry on it, like, if you present the case and then it's a no-brainer, like, there's nothing for them to say. Like, okay, great, go ahead.
You can't use that, but he's referencing a Slack that he sent me today, and I said, that's a no-brainer. Why haven't we done that? So, but I don't have much more. I know we're at top of the hour. I would just say, if everybody in that plant on something you can control, make sure you understand that metrics and come up with ideas around, what if I did this? What would be the return on investment? Just change the way you think, instead of, as a CEO, if Allan comes up to me with problems, I tell him, I got enough problems. That's why I hired you, right? Give me solutions, not problems. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks. That wraps up Shift Change for today, everybody. Thanks for Jerry and Allan. And if you'd like to learn more about connected worker technology, visit Dozuki.com. And thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye, everybody.